Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 7 deeply disturbing true cruise ship horror stories that will make you question what really happens when you are trapped miles from shore with nowhere to run. These are not fictional tales, but real encounters shared by passengers, crew members, and witnesses who experience terror on the open ocean where help is hours or days away. Each story has been carefully compiled from documented incidents, witness testimonies, and verified reports that expose the dark reality behind the luxury cruise industry. From mysterious disappearances in international waters to paranormal encounters in cabins where tragedy occurred. From catastrophic mechanical failures that left thousands stranded to crimes that were covered up by those in power. Tonight, we reveal what happens when paradise turns into a floating nightmare. The open ocean holds dangers that most vacationers never consider, and perhaps ignorance truly is bliss. If you enjoy authentic horror content drawn from real events that will keep you awake at night, subscribe to Buried Files and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into the unknown. After you listen to these chilling accounts, we want to hear from you in the comments below about your own cruise experiences or encounters with unexplained phenomena at sea. Now settle in as we explore the darkness that lurks beneath the surface of the cruise ship industry, where international waters mean international lawlessness, and where some passengers check in but never truly check out. Liam had worked as an assistant security officer aboard the Oceanic Majesty for 3 years. And in that time, he had seen nearly everything the cruise ship life had to offer. Drunken passengers stumbling through corridors at 4 a.m, petty thefts from cabins, the occasional medical emergency that required the ship to divert course. But nothing in his training or experience had prepared him for what he would witness on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning in the middle of the Caribbean Sea. The Oceanic Majesty was a floating city, one of the largest luxury cruise ships in the world, capable of carrying over 4,000 passengers and 1,500 crew members. It boasted 10 restaurants, 3 swimming pools, a rock climbing wall, and an ice skating rink. For most passengers, it represented the vacation of a lifetime. For Liam, it was simply his workplace. A massive vessel that required constant monitoring to ensure the safety and security of everyone aboard. His shift that night had been routine. He had spent most of it in the security office, a windowless room deep in the bowels of the ship, watching dozens of monitor screens that displayed live feeds from cameras positioned throughout the vessel. The overnight hours were usually quiet, with most passengers asleep in their cabins and only a handful of insomniacs wandering the casino or the 24-hour buffet on Deck 12. At 6:15 in the morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise over the endless expanse of ocean, a frantic man burst through the security office door. He was breathing heavily, his face flushed and his eyes wild with what appeared to be genuine panic. The man introduced himself as Noah, a passenger from cabin 723 on the starboard side. He was traveling with his wife, he explained, and she had vanished sometime during the night. Liam immediately activated the standard missing person protocol. He asked Noah when he had last seen his wife, what she had been wearing, whether they had argued, or if she had mentioned feeling unwell. Noah claimed he had fallen asleep around midnight and woke at 6 to find his wife gone. She was not in the bathroom, not on their balcony, not anywhere in the cabin. He had checked the nearby decks and corridors, but found no trace of her. Something about Noah's demeanor struck Liam as unusual. The man seemed agitated, certainly, but there was a performative quality to his distress that triggered Liam's instincts. In his years working security, he had developed a sense for when people were not being entirely truthful. Noah's eyes darted around the room too frequently. His hands trembled, but not in the way hands usually trembled from fear, It was more like the trembling that came from adrenaline, from having done something physically demanding. Liam assured Noah that they would locate his wife and asked him to return to his cabin while security conducted a thorough search. The moment Noah left the office, Liam began reviewing the camera footage from the previous night, starting with the camera's position near cabin 723 and the surrounding corridors. For the first hour of footage, there was nothing unusual. Passengers wandered past occasionally, heading to or from the elevator banks. At 11:47, Noah and his wife returned to their cabin, presumably for the night. They appeared to be having a conversation, though the cameras had no audio. The wife's body language suggested she was tired and ready for sleep. Then, at 3:15 in the morning, the couple emerged from their cabin again. This time, their interaction was markedly different. The wife was wearing the same dress from earlier, and she appeared to be trying to walk away from Noah, who kept reaching for her arm. They moved down the corridor toward the stern of the ship, passing through several camera zones. Liam watched carefully, his stomach beginning to tighten with a sense of dread. The footage showed them reaching the aft deck, an outdoor area at the rear of the ship that was usually deserted during the overnight hours. Here, the camera angle was less ideal, positioned high and at a distance to cover a wide area rather than focus on specific details. But Liam could see enough. He could see Noah and his wife standing near the railing. He could see what appeared to be an argument, though their faces were partially obscured. He could see Noah grab his wife's wrist when she tried to walk away. And then, at exactly 3:28 in the morning, the footage showed Noah standing alone at the railing. His wife was no longer visible in the frame. Liam felt his mouth go dry. He rewound the footage and watched it again, more carefully this time, noting every detail. At 3:27 and 40 seconds, both Noah and his wife were visible, standing close to the railing. At 3:28 and 10 seconds, only Noah remained. The transition happened during a brief moment when both figures were positioned in a way that made it difficult to see exactly what occurred. But the implication was clear and horrifying. Liam switched to the camera that monitored the water at the stern of the ship, a specialized camera designed to detect anything or anyone who might fall overboard. The footage from this camera was grainy and difficult to interpret, showing mostly darkness and the churning wake of the massive vessel. But at 3:31 in the morning, there was a small disturbance in the water. A tiny splash that was barely noticeable against the backdrop of the ship's enormous propulsion system. It could have been anything. A piece of debris, a large fish, or it could have been a person hitting the water and being immediately swept away by the powerful current created by the ship's movement. Liam's hands were shaking now as he continued reviewing the footage. At 3:33 in the morning, Noah reappeared on an interior camera, walking through a corridor on deck 7. Liam zoomed in on the image as much as the resolution would allow. Noah's right pocket appeared noticeably heavier than it had been earlier, sagging with the weight of something substantial. His wife's cell phone, perhaps, or her jewelry, or both. The security officer felt sick. He had seen thefts before, even assaults. But this was something far darker. He continued tracking Noah's movements through the ship. The man went to the Deck 10 buffet, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat at a table near the window, staring out at the dark ocean. He remained there for nearly an hour before returning to his cabin at 4:45 in the morning. Liam immediately contacted his supervisor and the captain. Within minutes, the ship's senior security team had assembled in the office to review the footage. Everyone reached the same grim conclusion. Something had happened to Noah's wife at the aft deck railing, and it appeared that Noah had been the only other person present. the ship's protocol for a person overboard was activated immediately. The captain ordered the vessel to turn around and retrace its course, though everyone in the security office knew that the chances of finding someone who had gone into the water more than 3 hours earlier were virtually non-existent. The ocean was vast and dark, and a human body would be nearly impossible to locate even in daylight, let alone in the pre-dawn hours. A massive search was organized throughout the ship. Every public area was checked. Every crew member was questioned. Announcements were made over the loudspeaker system, asking passengers to report any sighting of the missing woman. Her photograph was displayed on screens throughout the vessel. Security personnel went cabin to cabin on Deck 7, knocking on doors and asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual during the night. Noah participated in the search with what appeared to be genuine distress. He wandered the decks calling his wife's name. He broke down crying in front of other passengers. He cooperated fully with security, answering every question, allowing them to search his cabin, providing his wife's information for the official reports. To anyone who did not know about the camera footage, he appeared to be a devastated husband whose wife had mysteriously vanished. But Liam knew better. He had watched the footage a dozen times by now. He had seen the way Noah positioned himself between his wife and the rest of the deck. He had seen the physical contact. He had seen the moment when she disappeared from the frame. And most damning of all, he had noticed something that made his blood run cold. While reviewing the footage of the aft deck more carefully, Liam realized that all 4 safety rings that were normally mounted on the stern railing were missing from the footage. These were bright orange flotation devices designed to be thrown to anyone who fell overboard, and they were supposed to be permanently secured to the railing. But in the 3:15 footage, the mounting brackets were empty. Someone had removed the safety rings before Noah and his wife arrived at that location. Liam reported this finding to his supervisor, who immediately dispatched crew members to check the aft deck. They found all 4 safety rings hidden in a nearby storage locker, a location that only crew members were supposed to have access to, though Liam knew that determined passengers could sometimes obtain crew keys through various means. The implications were staggering. This had not been a spontaneous act. Someone had deliberately removed the safety equipment from that section of railing, eliminating any chance of rescue if someone went into the water. It suggested premeditation. It suggested planning. It suggested murder. The Coast Guard was notified, and they launched their own search operation, dispatching aircraft and vessels to sweep the area where the woman had likely gone overboard. But as the hours passed with no sign of her, hope faded. The ocean had claimed her, and her body would probably never be recovered. Meanwhile, Liam continued his investigation. Something was bothering him about Noah, something beyond the obvious suspicion raised by the camera footage. He decided to look into Noah's background and travel history. Using the ship's passenger database, he discovered something that made his stomach drop. This was Noah's 3rd cruise in the past 2 years. That in itself was not unusual. Many people enjoyed cruising and took multiple trips. But what was unusual was that Noah had been accompanied by a different female companion on each voyage. The first trip, 14 months ago, had been with a woman named Sarah. The second trip, 8 months ago, had been with a woman named Jennifer. And this trip had been with a woman who now appeared to be dead. Liam dug deeper, accessing what limited information was available in the passenger records. Both Sarah and Jennifer had also been reported missing during their respective cruises with Noah. Both incidents had occurred in international waters. Both cases had been investigated by the ship's security and reported to the appropriate authorities, but neither had resulted in any charges or arrests. Both women's bodies had never been recovered. The pattern was undeniable and absolutely chilling. Noah was traveling on luxury cruises with women, and those women were disappearing overboard under mysterious circumstances. 3 trips, 3 missing companions, 3 bodies lost to the ocean. Liam compiled all of this information and presented it to the captain and the senior security team. They were horrified, but also frustrated. The ship was currently in international waters, which complicated jurisdiction considerably. Additionally, the camera footage, while highly suspicious, did not definitively show Noah pushing his wife overboard. A defense attorney could argue that she had jumped or fallen accidentally while Noah tried to stop her. Without a body, without witnesses, without audio of their conversation, building a prosecutable case would be extremely difficult. The ship continued on toward its next port of call, which was Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The plan was to turn Noah over to the FBI as soon as the vessel docked in American waters. Federal agents would interview him and decide whether there was sufficient evidence to charge him with any crime. But until then, Noah remained a free man, walking the decks of the ship, eating at the buffets, even attending the evening shows in the theater. Liam found it unbearable. He watched Noah on the security cameras, seeing him laugh with other passengers, seeing him express gratitude to crew members who offered condolences about his missing wife. The man was a monster. Liam was certain of it. Yet he wore the mask of a grieving husband with disturbing skill. When the Oceanic Majesty finally docked in Fort Lauderdale 6 days after the woman's disappearance, FBI agents were waiting on the pier. They escorted Noah off the ship and took him to their field office for questioning. Liam provided them with copies of all the security footage and explained his findings about the previous 2 trips and the missing companions. But weeks later, Liam learned that Noah had been released. The FBI had insufficient evidence to charge him with murder. The previous cases were being reviewed, but without bodies, without definitive proof of foul play, the legal system was powerless to act. Noah walked free, disappearing into the vastness of America, presumably to plan his next cruise with his next victim. Liam left his job on the Oceanic Majesty 3 months later. He could not continue working in an environment where he had witnessed what he was certain was murder and been unable to stop the perpetrator from escaping justice. The footage still haunted him. That tiny splash in the dark water at 3:31 in the morning. A woman's life ending in the cold Atlantic while her killer stood on the deck above, already planning his alibi. The ocean keeps its secrets, and sometimes so do the people who sail upon it. Ethan had been looking forward to this vacation for months. After a grueling year, working 60-hour weeks as a software developer in Seattle, he desperately needed a break from the endless meetings, the crushing deadlines, and the gray Pacific Northwest weather that seemed to seep into his bones. A 7-day Caribbean cruise seemed like the perfect escape. Sun, warm water, exotic ports of call, and absolutely no laptop or cell phone service once the ship left port. It was going to be exactly what he needed. The cruise ship was magnificent, a modern marvel of engineering that stretched nearly 4 football fields in length and rose 16 stories above the waterline. The vessel could accommodate over 3,000 passengers and 1,200 crew members, making it one of the larger ships currently sailing the Caribbean route. Ethan's cabin was located on Deck 9, a comfortable interior room with no window but enough space for his luggage and a decent bed. He did not plan to spend much time in the cabin anyway. The ship offered too many attractions to waste time sleeping. The first 2 days were everything Ethan had hoped for. He spent his mornings lounging by the pool with a book he had been meaning to read for months, his afternoons exploring the ship's various restaurants and bars, and his evenings watching spectacular production shows in the main theater. The ship made its first port stop in Cozumel, Mexico, where Ethan went snorkeling in crystal-clear water and ate fresh ceviche at a beachside restaurant. Life was good. Life was perfect. On the morning of day 3, as Ethan was finishing breakfast at the buffet on deck 12, an announcement came over the ship's loudspeaker system. The captain's voice was calm and professional, the kind of practiced tone designed to convey information without causing alarm. He informed passengers that the ship's medical team had identified several cases of gastrointestinal illness among passengers and crew. As a precautionary measure, enhanced cleaning protocols were being implemented throughout the vessel. Passengers were encouraged to wash their hands frequently and to report to the medical center if they experienced any symptoms of nausea, vomiting, or diarrhea. Ethan felt a small flutter of concern, but dismissed it quickly. Norovirus outbreaks on cruise ships were not uncommon. He had read about them before booking his trip. The illness was unpleasant, but usually passed quickly, and cruise lines were generally very good at containing the spread. He made a mental note to be more careful about hand washing and continued with his day. By that evening, however, the situation had clearly deteriorated. Ethan noticed that several restaurants had been closed, with signs posted indicating they were undergoing deep cleaning. The buffet was still open, but now crew members wearing plastic gloves served all the food instead of allowing passengers to serve themselves. Hand sanitizer stations had been set up every few feet throughout the ship, and crew members stood at every entrance to dining areas, squirting sanitizer onto passengers' hands, whether they wanted it or not. The ship's daily newsletter, which was delivered to every cabin each evening, contained an update from the captain. The number of reported illness cases had risen to 73 passengers and 12 crew members. All affected individuals were being confined to their cabins and treated by the medical team. The ship would not be making its scheduled stop in Grand Cayman the following day. Instead, it would remain at sea to prevent the potential spread of illness to the island population. Ethan felt his anxiety increasing. 73 cases seemed like a lot, though he tried to remind himself that with over 3,000 passengers aboard, it was still a relatively small percentage. He went to bed that night, hoping the situation would improve by morning. It did not improve. It got exponentially worse. Day 4 began with another announcement from the captain. The number of ill passengers had exploded overnight to over 400. The situation had escalated from a minor outbreak to a full-blown crisis. The CDC had been notified. The ship would not be making any further port stops until the outbreak was under control. And most alarmingly, all passengers were now ordered to remain in their cabins except for essential medical needs. Meals would be delivered to cabin doors. All public areas were closed. The ship was going into complete lockdown. Ethan's heart sank as he heard the announcement. He was trapped in a windowless interior cabin, with no idea how long this confinement would last. Within an hour, crew members were going deck to deck, ensuring that all passengers had returned to their rooms. Ethan heard them knocking on doors in the corridor, their voices firm but polite as they instructed everyone to comply with the lockdown order. The first day of confinement was merely uncomfortable. Ethan had his book, his phone with downloaded movies, and occasional Wi-Fi access that allowed him to send brief messages to his family, letting them know he was safe. The food delivered to his cabin was cold and uninspiring. Pre-packaged sandwiches and fruit that had clearly been assembled in bulk, but it was edible. He could hear other passengers in neighboring cabins, the occasional sound of conversation or footsteps, which provided some reassurance that he was not completely alone. But by the second day of lockdown, the sounds from neighboring cabins had changed. Ethan began hearing people vomiting. The walls were thin enough that he could hear the unmistakable sound of retching. followed by toilet flushing, followed by more retching. It seemed to be coming from multiple cabins around him. The illness was spreading through his section of the ship like wildfire. The smell started on the third day of confinement. It was subtle at first, just a faint, unpleasant odor that Ethan noticed when he opened his cabin door to retrieve his meal tray. But within hours, it had become overwhelming, a nauseating stench of human waste and disinfectant that permeated the entire corridor. Ethan stuffed towels under his door, trying to block the smell. But it seeped through anyway, making his already claustrophobic cabin feel even more unbearable. He later learned what was happening from whispered conversations with other passengers when they occasionally opened their doors to collect food trays. The ship's sewage system was failing under the strain of thousands of people simultaneously suffering from severe gastrointestinal distress. Toilets were backing up. Waste was overflowing. The crew was doing their best to clean up, but they were overwhelmed, and many crew members were sick themselves. The ship was becoming a floating nightmare, and there was no escape. On day 4 of the lockdown, Ethan noticed that the vessel had begun rocking more violently. He had his phone's weather app and saw that a tropical storm system was moving through the area. Without the ship's stabilizer systems operating at full capacity, or perhaps because the crew was too depleted to properly manage the ship's navigation, the massive vessel was being tossed by increasingly large waves. Ethan, who had never been prone to seasickness, found himself feeling nauseated for the first time. Though he could not tell if it was from the motion of the ship, the terrible smell, or simply anxiety about his situation. The heat was also becoming unbearable. Ethan realized that the air conditioning in his cabin was no longer functioning properly. The temperature had risen to what felt like over 90 degrees, and there was no air circulation. He stripped down to his underwear and lay on the bed, sweating and miserable, wondering how this vacation had turned into such a complete disaster. The food deliveries became less frequent and lower quality. Instead of 3 meals a day, passengers were receiving 2. Instead of sandwiches and fruit, they were getting protein bars and crackers. Water bottles were being rationed, with crew members instructing passengers to limit themselves to 2 bottles per day. Ethan heard rumors through the thin walls that the ship's food supplies were running low because the outbreak had lasted much longer than anyone had anticipated. On the 5th day of lockdown, Ethan heard something that terrified him more than anything else so far. Late at night, long after the corridor lights had been dimmed, he heard the sound of movement outside his door. He peered through the peephole and saw crew members dressed in full hazmat suits wheeling a gurney down the hallway. On the gurney was a form completely covered by a white sheet. The crew members moved quickly and quietly, disappearing around the corner toward the elevators. Ethan's blood ran cold. He knew what a body looked like when it was being transported. Someone had died. Someone on his deck, possibly in a cabin just meters from his own, had died from this illness or from complications related to it. He tried to tell himself that it might have been an elderly passenger with pre-existing health conditions, that norovirus itself was rarely fatal, that there could be many explanations. But lying alone in his sweltering cabin, listening to the sounds of sick people all around him, watching the room pitch and roll with the storm outside, Ethan could not stop his mind from going to dark places. What if the illness was worse than norovirus? What if it was something the ship's medical team could not treat? What if more people were dying and the crew was simply not telling the passengers to avoid panic? Over the next 2 days, Ethan saw 3 more gurneys wheeled past his cabin in the night. He was not the only one who noticed. He could hear other passengers opening their doors, whispering to each other in the corridor despite the lockdown orders, their voices tight with fear. Someone claimed to have overheard crew members saying that 9 people had died so far. Someone else insisted it was more than 20. No one knew what to believe because the official announcements from the captain had become increasingly vague and infrequent. On day 7 of the lockdown, some passengers reached their breaking point. Ethan heard shouting from several decks below, the sound of people refusing to stay in their cabins any longer. There was a commotion that seemed to involve dozens of people, though Ethan could only hear it through his cabin walls and floor. He heard what might have been security personnel trying to restore order. He heard someone screaming that they would rather die on deck in the fresh air than suffocate in their cabin. The attempted rebellion, if that was what it was, did not last long. Within an hour, the corridors were quiet again. Ethan never learned what exactly had happened or whether any passengers had actually managed to escape their cabins. The silence was somehow worse than the shouting had been. The temperatures continued to climb. Ethan's thermometer, which he had packed for tracking his fitness metrics, registered 98 degrees Fahrenheit in his cabin. He was drinking his rationed water as slowly as possible, but his mouth was constantly dry and his head ached from dehydration. He had stopped sweating, which he knew was a bad sign. His thoughts were becoming fuzzy and disconnected. He spent most of his time lying motionless on the bed, trying to conserve energy, trying not to think about how much longer this could possibly continue. On what Ethan later learned was day 9 of the cruise, 2 days beyond when it was supposed to have ended, the captain made an announcement that nearly brought Ethan to tears with relief. The ship was approaching Port Everglades in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. They would be docking within 3 hours. However, passengers would not be immediately allowed to disembark. CDC officials were waiting at the port to assess the situation, and all passengers would need to be evaluated and cleared before they could leave the ship. When Ethan finally felt the ship's engines shut down and sensed the vessel coming to a stop, he opened his cabin door for the first time in days and stepped into the corridor. The smell nearly knocked him over. Other passengers were emerging from their cabins as well, and Ethan was shocked by their appearance. People looked gaunt, pale, exhausted. Some were being supported by family members. Everyone had the same hollow-eyed expression of people who had endured something traumatic. The disembarkation process was a nightmare in itself. Passengers were required to gather in the main theater, where CDC personnel in full protective equipment took their temperatures, asked them questions about their symptoms, and made notes on clipboards. Anyone who showed signs of illness was being separated from the general population and taken to a quarantine facility on land. Ethan watched families being torn apart, with sick members being led away to buses while healthy members were directed to different areas. It took 14 hours from the time the ship docked until Ethan was finally cleared to leave. He walked down the gangway on shaking legs, carrying his luggage past a gauntlet of news cameras and reporters who were documenting what had become an international incident. The cruise line stock price had plummeted. Lawsuits were already being filed. Congressional hearings were being planned. Ethan made it to his hotel room near the airport and immediately got into the shower, scrubbing himself with water as hot as he could stand, trying to wash away the memory of those 9 days. But no amount of soap could erase what he had experienced. The sounds of people being sick, the smell of sewage and fear, the gurneys wheeling past his door in the night, the rising heat and dwindling supplies, the dawning realization that he was trapped in a situation beyond his control, floating in the middle of the ocean with thousands of other people, all of them at the mercy of a virus that had turned a luxury vacation into a floating prison. He later learned that the official death toll from the outbreak was 11 passengers and 2 crew members. The cruise line disputed these numbers, claiming that some of the deaths were from pre-existing conditions and not directly attributable to the norovirus outbreak. It did not matter to Ethan. He had heard those gurneys. He knew what he had experienced. 6 months later, Ethan still had nightmares about being trapped in that cabin. He had developed anxiety about confined spaces and had started seeing a therapist to help him process the trauma. His family asked if he would ever consider going on another cruise. The question was absurd. Ethan would never set foot on a cruise ship again for as long as he lived. The ocean had seemed so inviting when the trip began. All that beautiful blue water, sparkling in the Caribbean sun. Now when Ethan thought of the ocean, he thought only of isolation and helplessness, of being trapped on a diseased vessel with no way to escape, watching the horizon and knowing that land was out there somewhere but impossibly far away. Some vacations change your life. This one had nearly ended his. Mason had worked in the housekeeping department of the Royal Caribbean Star for nearly 8 years. And in that time, he had cleaned thousands of cabins and heard countless stories from crew members about the strange things that happened aboard the aging vessel. The ship was 41 years old, one of the oldest cruise ships still in regular service. And like many old vessels, it had developed a reputation among the crew for being haunted. Most of the stories were easy to dismiss. Crew members working long hours in the windowless bowels of the ship, exhausted from double shifts, their minds playing tricks on them in the endless, identical corridors. The strange sounds could always be explained by the ship's ancient plumbing system or the groaning of metal under stress as the vessel moved through rough seas. Mason had always been skeptical of such tales, preferring to focus on his work and dismiss supernatural explanations as the product of overactive imaginations. But Cabin 412 was different. Even Mason, with all his skepticism, could not ignore the persistent problems associated with that particular room. Cabin 412 was located on the 4th deck, in a section of the ship that housed interior cabins with no windows or balconies. It was one of the most affordable cabin categories, popular with budget-conscious travelers and families who planned to spend most of their time exploring the ship rather than staying in their rooms. On paper, there was nothing unusual about Cabin 412. It was identical in layout and furnishings to the other interior cabins on the deck. But in practice, it had become a source of constant complaints and requests for cabin transfers. The first time Mason paid serious attention to the cabin's reputation was during a staff meeting where the housekeeping supervisor was discussing the high rate of early checkouts and transfer requests from Cabin 412. In a single 6-month period, 23 different sets of passengers had requested to be moved to different cabins, and 6 families had cut their vacations short entirely, disembarking at the next port rather than spending additional nights aboard the ship. This was a highly unusual pattern that was affecting customer satisfaction scores and costing the cruise line money in refunds and compensation. Mason decided to investigate the history of Cabin 412. Using the ship's internal record system, which documented everything from maintenance requests to passenger complaints, he began tracing the cabin's history back through the years. What he discovered sent a chill down his spine. 15 years earlier, during a repositioning cruise from Miami to Barcelona, a 73-year-old passenger named Edward Brennan had died in Cabin 412. According to the medical report, he had suffered a massive heart attack in the early morning hours and was found by his wife at approximately 6:30 in the morning when she woke and realized he was not breathing. The ship's medical team had attempted resuscitation, but Edward had been dead for several hours by the time he was discovered. His body had been kept in the ship's morgue for the remainder of the voyage and was released to his family when the vessel reached Barcelona. The death itself was not particularly unusual. Cruise ships, especially those carrying older passengers, experienced medical emergencies and deaths with some regularity. But what caught Mason's attention were the passenger complaints that had begun immediately after Edward's death and had continued with remarkable consistency ever since. Guests staying in cabin 412 reported feeling an overwhelming sense of being watched. They described the air in the cabin as unnaturally cold, even when the thermostat was set to maximum heat. They complained of belongings being moved from where they had been placed, finding their clothes hanging in different positions in the closet or their toiletries rearranged in the bathroom. Several passengers had reported seeing the figure of an elderly man standing at the foot of the bed, always appearing between 2 and 4 in the morning, always standing perfectly still, always vanishing the moment the lights were turned on. Mason found detailed accounts in the complaint records. One family from Ohio had described waking to find all the drawers in the cabin opened, though they had been closed when they went to sleep. A couple from England reported that the television turned itself on repeatedly during the night, always tuning to the same channel showing the ship's bow camera feed. A solo traveler from Australia had fled the cabin in the middle of the night, refusing to return even to collect her belongings, claiming that something had touched her face while she was sleeping, and that she had felt breath on her neck. The most disturbing reports came from passengers who had no knowledge of the cabin's history. They described the elderly man they had seen in remarkable detail. Thin build, white hair, wearing what appeared to be old-fashioned striped pajamas. Several passengers had sketched pictures of the figure they had encountered. When Mason showed these sketches to crew members who had worked on the ship 15 years ago, 2 of them immediately identified the figure as matching Edward Brennan's appearance. Mason decided to review the security camera footage from the corridor outside cabin 412. The ship's security system kept recordings for only 30 days, but Mason managed to obtain footage from a recent cruise when passengers had filed complaints about the cabin. What he saw on those recordings defied rational explanation. The footage showed cabin 412's door opening and closing by itself on multiple occasions throughout the night. The door would swing open slowly, remain open for exactly 30 seconds, then close again with the deadbolt somehow engaging despite no one being visible in the corridor. This happened at 3:14 in the morning on 3 consecutive nights, always at exactly the same time. Mason watched the footage dozens of times, looking for any indication of tampering or malfunction. But the door's movements were smooth and deliberate, not jerky like a mechanical failure would produce. And the timing was too precise to be coincidental. Something was causing that door to open at 3:14 every single morning, and Mason could not find any logical explanation. The ship's maintenance department had been called to cabin 412 more than 40 times over the past 5 years to investigate problems with the lights, the thermostat, the television, the plumbing, and the door lock. Every single time, the technicians found that all the systems were functioning perfectly. There was never any mechanical fault that could explain the issues passengers were experiencing. Mason knew he needed to experience the cabin for himself if he was going to understand what was happening. On a night when cabin 412 was unoccupied between cruises, he obtained permission from his supervisor to spend a few hours in the room conducting what he told management was a thorough inspection for potential maintenance issues. He entered the cabin at 11 o'clock at night, armed with a clipboard and a checklist of items to examine. The moment he stepped through the door, he felt it. The temperature in the cabin was noticeably colder than the corridor, despite the thermostat reading showing 72 degrees. But it was more than just cold. There was a heaviness to the air, a thickness that made breathing slightly more difficult. Mason had cleaned thousands of cabins and had never experienced anything like this sensation. He forced himself to proceed with the inspection, checking the bathroom fixtures, examining the closet, testing the television remote. Everything appeared normal, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing minute. Mason found himself constantly glancing over his shoulder, expecting to see someone standing behind him, though he knew he was alone in the cabin. At 3:14 in the morning, Mason heard it. A sound like labored breathing, raspy and strained, coming from the area near the bed. He froze, his heart pounding, every instinct screaming at him to leave the cabin immediately. But he forced himself to remain still, listening intently. The breathing continued for nearly a minute, growing gradually weaker until it faded into silence. Mason turned on all the lights in the cabin and moved toward the bed. The temperature in that specific area was even colder than the rest of the room. He extended his hand toward the spot where the breathing sound had originated and felt a coldness so intense it made his fingers ache. It was as if the air itself was frozen in that particular location. Then he saw it. A translucent figure began to materialize at the foot of the bed. It was indistinct at first, just a vague human-shaped shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising from pavement on a summer day. But within seconds, the figure became more defined. An elderly man, thin and frail, wearing striped pajamas, standing perfectly still and staring directly at Mason, with eyes that held an expression of profound confusion. Mason stumbled backward, knocking into the desk chair and nearly falling. His breath came in short gasps, his rational mind unable to process what his eyes were seeing. The figure remained motionless for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving Mason alone in the cabin with his racing heart and trembling hands. He left cabin 412 immediately and spent the rest of the night in the crew mess, drinking coffee and trying to convince himself that he had imagined the entire experience. But he knew he had not imagined it. He had seen Edward Brennan's ghost as clearly as he had ever seen any living person. The next morning, Mason met with the ship's captain and the hotel director. He provided them with all the documentation he had gathered: the passenger complaints, the maintenance records, the security footage showing the door opening by itself. He told them about his own experience in the cabin, though he was careful to present the information as factually as possible, knowing that talk of ghosts would make him sound unreliable. The captain listened to everything Mason had to say, and then made a decision. Cabin 412 would be officially taken out of the booking system. It would remain on the ship's deck plans and would continue to have a cabin number, but it would never again be sold to passengers. The room would be used for storage of extra linens and supplies, and crew members would only enter it during daylight hours and never alone. Mason was relieved by this decision, though he knew it was not a true solution to the problem. Edward Brennan's spirit remained in cabin 412, trapped or bound to the place where he had died, endlessly reliving those final moments when his heart had stopped beating and he had taken his last breath. The old man's ghost would continue opening the door at 3:14 in the morning, would continue standing at the foot of the bed where his body had grown cold, would continue searching for something that Mason suspected even the ghost itself no longer remembered. The Royal Caribbean Star continued sailing its regular routes, carrying thousands of passengers to beautiful destinations throughout the Caribbean. And on the fourth deck, in the section of interior cabins where budget-conscious travelers slept peacefully, cabin 412 remained dark and locked, its door marked with a maintenance tag that ensured no one would accidentally disturb what dwelt within. Some doors, Mason had learned, should never be opened. Lucas had never been on a cruise ship before, and by day 3 of his Caribbean vacation, he was completely enchanted by the experience. The vessel was spectacular, a massive floating resort that carried over 4,000 passengers and offered more restaurants, bars, pools, and entertainment options than he could possibly explore in a single week. The weather had been perfect, the food was excellent, and Lucas had spent his days alternating between lying by the pool with a cold drink and exploring the various ports of call. Life could not have been better. That illusion of perfection shattered at 5 o'clock in the morning on day 4. Lucas was jolted awake by a sound unlike anything he had ever heard before. A deep, thunderous bang that seemed to come from the very heart of the ship. The entire vessel shuddered violently, and Lucas was thrown from his bed onto the floor of his cabin. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely before emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then the alarm started blaring, a piercing wail that made Lucas's ears ring. He scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding, trying to understand what was happening. The ship felt wrong. The normal, constant hum of the engines that had become background noise over the past 3 days was gone, replaced by an unsettling quiet, punctuated only by the alarm and the sound of panicked voices in the corridor outside his cabin. Lucas grabbed his life jacket from the closet where it had been stored and pulled on a pair of shorts and a shirt. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely tie his shoes. The voice came over the loudspeaker system, the captain speaking in that carefully controlled tone that authority figures use when they are trying to prevent panic while delivering terrible news. All passengers were to report immediately to their assigned muster stations. This was not a drill. There had been an incident in the engine room. The crew was working to assess the situation. Everyone needed to remain calm and follow instructions. Lucas joined the stream of passengers flooding into the corridors, most of them in various states of undress, clutching life jackets, their faces reflecting the same fear he felt. The ship was listing slightly to one side, and walking required effort to maintain balance. They made their way to the muster station, a large gathering area on one of the outer decks where they had been instructed to assemble during the mandatory safety drill on the first day of the cruise. When Lucas reached his muster station, he could see smoke. Thick, black smoke was billowing from the stern of the ship, rising into the dawn sky. The smell of burning fuel and melted plastic filled the air, acrid and choking. Other passengers were pointing and taking photographs with their phones, though Lucas noticed there was no cell service this far out at sea. The enormity of their isolation hit him like a physical blow. They were in the middle of the Caribbean, hours from land, on a ship that was clearly on fire. The crew members at the muster station were doing their best to maintain order, conducting roll calls and ensuring everyone was accounted for. They distributed additional life jackets to those who had forgotten theirs in the panic. A senior officer addressed the assembled passengers, explaining that there had been an explosion in one of the engine rooms and that a fire had broken out. The fire suppression systems were engaged, and the crew was working to contain the blaze. All passengers needed to remain at their muster stations until further notice. Hours passed. The sun rose, revealing the full scope of their situation. The ship was completely dead in the water, floating without power, drifting with the current. The stabilizers that normally kept the vessel steady were not functioning. And as the morning went on, the ship began to rock more violently in the swells. Passengers who had never experienced seasickness before were becoming ill, leaning over the railings or collapsing in miserable heaps on the deck. By mid-morning, the captain made another announcement. The fire in the engine room had been extinguished, but the damage was extensive. Both main engines were offline. The ship had no propulsion and no power generation capability. They were working to restart the emergency generators to restore minimal electrical power. But it would take time. The Coast Guard had been notified, and rescue operations were being coordinated. When the power failed to return by afternoon, Lucas began to understand just how dire their situation was. The air conditioning throughout the ship was not functioning. The temperature inside the vessel began to climb rapidly as the Caribbean sun beat down on the metal hull. Within hours, the interior of the ship had become an oven. Passengers abandoned their cabins and gathered on the open decks, seeking any relief from the oppressive heat. Lucas watched the thermometer on his watch climb past 95 degrees, then 100, then higher. The food situation became apparent by dinner time. Without power, the ship's massive refrigeration systems were not working. Thousands of pounds of food were spoiling rapidly in the heat. The crew distributed what they could, non-perishable items like crackers and granola bars. But it was nowhere near enough to feed 4,000 people. Lucas received a single protein bar and a bottle of water for dinner. He was told to ration the water carefully, as the desalination systems that normally provided fresh water to the ship were also offline. By the end of the first day without power, the toilet stopped working. The ship's plumbing system required electricity to function, and without it, waste began backing up throughout the vessel. Passengers were instructed to use designated areas of the lower decks, where crew members were distributing large, plastic bags for human waste. The dignity of vacation had completely evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of survival. Lucas spent that first night on an open deck, unable to sleep in his cabin, which had become unbearably hot and was beginning to smell terrible as the plumbing failed. He lay on a deck chair, staring up at the stars, listening to the sound of children crying and adults arguing. The fantasy of a luxury cruise had transformed into a nightmare of heat, thirst, and growing desperation. Day 2 adrift was worse. The heat was relentless, and people were beginning to show signs of dehydration. Medical emergencies were increasing. Lucas saw crew members rushing through the crowds with first aid kits, attending to passengers who had collapsed. The ship's medical center was overwhelmed with cases of heat exhaustion, dehydration, and injuries from people falling as the vessel continued to pitch and roll in the waves. The bags of human waste were piling up in the corridors on the lower decks. The smell had become unbearable, permeating every part of the ship. Lucas tied a shirt over his nose and mouth, but it did little to block the stench. He saw passengers fighting over the limited food and water that was being distributed. The veneer of civilization was cracking under the pressure of the situation. On day 3, Lucas noticed something strange. He had been standing at the railing late at night, unable to sleep, when he saw lights in the water. They were not normal reflections or bioluminescence. These lights were structured, geometric patterns that moved beneath the surface in synchronized formations. They appeared to be following the ship, staying at a consistent distance, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. Lucas pointed them out to other passengers nearby, and several confirmed they could see the lights as well. Someone suggested they might be submarines, but the patterns were too unusual for any submarine Lucas had ever heard of. The lights would cluster together, then spread apart, forming shapes that resembled nothing from nature or human engineering. They remained visible for nearly an hour before suddenly disappearing all at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. The next night, the lights returned. This time, even more passengers witnessed the phenomenon. Someone claimed to have recorded video on their phone, though without any way to upload it or share it beyond the ship. The footage remained confined to a single device. The lights seemed to be circling the vessel, staying at a depth of perhaps 50 to 100 feet below the surface. Their behavior was too organized, too purposeful to be any natural phenomenon Lucas could think of. On day 4, when a Coast Guard helicopter finally flew overhead to assess the situation, Lucas watched several passengers frantically pointing at the water, trying to direct the pilot's attention to where the lights had been. but in the bright daylight, there was nothing visible beneath the waves. The helicopter crew photographed the ship and departed, presumably to report on the conditions and coordinate the rescue effort. The tugboats arrived on day 5, two massive vessels that approached from the northeast. The entire ship erupted in cheers when passengers spotted them on the horizon. Finally, they were going to be rescued. Finally, this ordeal would end. But the relief was short-lived. As the tugs attempted to attach tow ropes to the cruise ship, one of the massive cables snapped under the strain, whipping back with enough force to damage the tug's superstructure. The operation had to be suspended while the tugboat crew made repairs. Lucas felt despair settling over him like a physical weight. They were so close to rescue, and yet they remained trapped on this floating prison, surrounded by the endless ocean. The lights appeared again that night, and Lucas found himself wondering if there was some connection between the strange underwater phenomena and the ship's catastrophic failure. It seemed impossible, yet the timing was too coincidental to ignore completely. On day 6, the tugboats finally succeeded in attaching secure tow lines, and the long journey to the nearest port began. The cruise ship moved at an agonizingly slow pace, perhaps 5 miles per hour, pulled by the straining tugs. Lucas calculated it would take at least another full day to reach land. He was not sure he could endure another day in these conditions. His lips were cracked from dehydration despite the rationed water. His skin was burned from the relentless sun. He had lost weight and felt weak and disoriented. When the ship finally reached port on day 7, passengers practically stampeded down the gangways. Medical personnel were waiting to treat the most severe cases of dehydration and heat exhaustion. News crews were filming everything, documenting what was being called one of the worst cruise ship disasters in recent history. Lucas stumbled down the gangway and onto solid ground, his legs barely able to support his weight. In the aftermath, investigators examined the ship and concluded that the engine fire had been caused by a catastrophic mechanical failure. But Lucas knew there was more to the story. He had seen those lights, and so had dozens of other passengers. Whatever had been circling the ship in the darkness remained a mystery, one that would haunt Lucas for the rest of his life. Some experiences cannot be explained, only endured. And some questions are better left unasked. Henry Morrison had worked for 43 years as an accountant for a mid-sized firm in Des Moines, Iowa. He had raised 3 children with his wife Margaret, paid off their modest house, and carefully saved for retirement. When he finally submitted his retirement paperwork at 75 years old, his lifelong dream was within reach. He and Margaret were going to take a Caribbean cruise, something they had talked about for decades, but never quite managed to afford while raising their family and putting their children through college. They booked a 14-day cruise departing from Fort Lauderdale, with stops in Jamaica, Grand Cayman, Cozumel, and Belize. The ship was one of the newer vessels in the cruise line's fleet, capable of carrying 3,500 passengers and offering every amenity Henry and Margaret could imagine. They selected a balcony cabin on the 8th deck, splurging on the upgrade because they wanted this trip to be perfect. The first day of the cruise exceeded all their expectations. Henry and Margaret explored the ship, marveled at the size of the buffet, attended the welcome aboard show in the theater, and stood on their balcony watching the Florida coastline disappear as the vessel headed out into the Atlantic. Henry felt healthier and happier than he had in years. This was the beginning of the retirement he had earned, and he intended to savor every moment. On the second night of the cruise, Henry and Margaret dressed up for the formal dinner in the main dining room. They had been seated at a table with 3 other couples, all retirees like themselves. and the conversation flowed easily as they enjoyed a 5-course meal. Henry ordered the prime rib, cooked medium rare, and pronounced it the best he had ever tasted. Margaret laughed at his enthusiasm, reminding him that he said the same thing about every meal he ate on vacation. After dinner, they attended a magic show in the theater, then took a stroll around the promenade deck, enjoying the warm Caribbean air and the sight of the stars reflected on the black water. Henry felt a slight tightness in his chest as they walked, but he dismissed it as the result of eating too much at dinner. They returned to their cabin around 10:30 and prepared for bed. Margaret woke at 2:15 in the morning to use the bathroom. When she returned to bed, she noticed that Henry was breathing strangely, making a rasping sound with each breath. She turned on the light and saw that his face was gray, his lips tinged with blue. She shook him, calling his name, but he did not respond. Margaret ran to the cabin phone and dialed 0 for the operator, screaming that her husband needed help immediately. Within 3 minutes, there was pounding on the cabin door. 2 medical personnel rushed in with a rolling case of emergency equipment. They began working on Henry, checking his pulse, his breathing, his pupils. One of them started chest compressions, while the other prepared a defibrillator. Margaret stood in the corner of the cabin, her hands pressed over her mouth, watching them try to save her husband. She heard one of them say something about ventricular fibrillation. She heard the whine of the defibrillator charging, then the thump as they shocked Henry's chest. His body arched off the bed, then settled back. The medical personnel checked for a pulse, found none, and shocked him again. After 20 minutes of resuscitation attempts, the senior medical officer made the decision to stop. Henry was gone. His heart had given out, a massive coronary event that had likely killed him within minutes. There was nothing anyone could have done to save him, even if the ship had been docked at the finest hospital in the world. Margaret's husband of 52 years was dead. The medical officer expressed his condolences and explained that they needed to move Henry's body to the ship's medical facility. Margaret watched in numb shock as they placed her husband on a gurney, covered him with a white sheet, and wheeled him out of the cabin. She was left alone in the room where just hours earlier she and Henry had been laughing about the magic show, making plans for their shore excursion in Jamaica. A senior crew member arrived an hour later to discuss the arrangements. Margaret had 2 options. The ship could disembark Henry's body at the next port, which was San Juan, Puerto Rico, arriving in 2 days. Margaret would need to leave the cruise at that point and handle the repatriation of her husband's body to Iowa, which would involve hiring a local funeral home, dealing with international paperwork, and likely spending several days in Puerto Rico navigating a foreign bureaucracy. The alternative was for Henry's body to remain on the ship until it returned to Fort Lauderdale in 12 more days. The vessel had a morgue facility designed specifically for this unfortunate but not uncommon occurrence. Henry would be properly stored and cared for, and Margaret could disembark in Florida where her family could meet her, and where American funeral homes could handle all the arrangements without the complications of international transport. The crew member was persuasive in presenting the second option. He emphasized how much easier it would be for Margaret to handle everything in Florida. He mentioned that her children could meet her there. He pointed out that she had already paid for the cruise and that Henry would have wanted her to enjoy the remainder of the trip as a tribute to his memory. Margaret, overwhelmed with grief and unable to think clearly, agreed to let Henry's body remain on the ship. The next 12 days were surreal. Margaret went through the motions of the cruise, attending meals, visiting the ports of call, sitting on her balcony and crying while watching the ocean. Other passengers who learned of her loss offered condolences. The ship's staff checked on her daily, ensuring she was eating and coping with her grief. Several times, Margaret asked if she could see Henry's body, but she was told that it was not possible, that the morgue was a restricted area, that it would be better for her to remember him as he was. When the ship finally docked in Fort Lauderdale, Margaret's 3 children were waiting for her, along with a representative from the funeral home they had selected. The funeral director had arranged to collect Henry's body directly from the ship and transport it to Iowa for the services Margaret had been planning during those long days at sea. But when the funeral director boarded the vessel to retrieve the body, he discovered something that would haunt Margaret for the rest of her life. Henry's body was not in the ship's morgue. The morgue, according to what the funeral director was told by the ship's crew, had been out of service since before the cruise began. Instead, Henry had been stored in a large drink cooler in one of the ship's lower storage areas. His body had been placed in a thick plastic body bag and laid on a wooden pallet on the floor of the cooler, surrounded by cases of beer and soft drinks waiting to be moved to the ship's bars and restaurants. The cooler's temperature was supposed to be maintained at approximately 40 degrees Fahrenheit, adequate for storing beverages but far too warm for properly preserving a human body, especially in the tropical heat of the Caribbean. By the time the funeral director accessed the storage area, Henry's body had been in inadequate refrigeration for nearly 2 weeks. The decomposition was extensive. Margaret's children tried to shield her from the full details, but she demanded to know everything. She learned that her husband's body had been stored in conditions normally reserved for drinks inventory. She learned that the ship's crew had known the morgue was not functional, but had not disclosed this to her when presenting her options. She learned that the promises of proper care and storage had been lies designed to keep her on the cruise rather than dealing with the complications of disembarking a body in Puerto Rico. Most devastating of all, the funeral director informed the family that an open casket viewing, which Margaret had wanted and which her children had been planning, was no longer possible. The decomposition had been too severe. Henry would need to be cremated or buried in a sealed casket. Margaret would never see her husband's face one final time to say goodbye. The family filed a lawsuit against the cruise line, seeking damages for negligence, emotional distress, and what they termed the desecration of Henry's remains. The cruise line's lawyers responded with motions to dismiss, arguing that the company had acted within maritime law and that they had provided appropriate storage given the circumstances. The case dragged on for 3 years. During the discovery phase of the lawsuit, Margaret's attorneys obtained photographs of the storage area where Henry's body had been kept. The images showed exactly what the funeral director had described: a commercial beverage cooler with metal shelving units stacked with soft drinks, beer, and juice, a wooden pallet on the floor, the thick black body bag containing Henry's remains, cases of Corona beer stacked against the wall just feet from where her husband's body lay. The cruise line eventually settled the case out of court for an undisclosed sum, with a non-disclosure agreement preventing Margaret or her children from discussing the specific details of the settlement. But the damage had been done. Margaret developed post-traumatic stress disorder from the experience. She had nightmares about Henry lying in that cooler, surrounded by beer cases, while she ate dinner in the dining room above, completely unaware of how her husband was being treated. She learned from her attorneys that this was not an isolated incident. Multiple cruise ships had been cited for inadequate morgue facilities or for improperly storing deceased passengers' bodies. The maritime industry had very little regulation regarding the treatment of human remains, and cruise lines often prioritized operational convenience over dignity for the deceased and their families. Margaret never recovered from the betrayal. She had trusted the cruise line to care for her husband's body. She had been assured that proper protocols would be followed. Instead, Henry's final journey had been spent in a beverage cooler. his remains deteriorating in inadequate refrigeration, while the ship's bars continued to serve drinks stored just feet from his body. The family held a memorial service for Henry rather than a traditional funeral. Margaret placed his ashes in an urn that now sat on her mantel, next to their wedding photograph and pictures from their 52 years together. But every time she looked at that urn, she could not help but think about those 12 days when she had believed her husband was being treated with respect and care, when in reality he had been stored like cargo in a cooler designed for beverages. Henry had worked his entire life for that retirement cruise. He had earned it through decades of labor and sacrifice. And in the end, the vacation that was supposed to be the fulfillment of his dreams had become the setting for one final indignity, a betrayal that would haunt his widow for the rest of her days. The ocean had taken Margaret's husband from her, but it was the cruise line's negligence that had robbed her of the chance to say a proper goodbye. Jack had been looking forward to the sunset deck party since he boarded the cruise ship 4 days earlier. It was the 5th night of the voyage, and the weather was perfect. The Caribbean sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Hundreds of passengers had gathered on the aft deck for the nightly celebration, a combination of live music, dancing, and complimentary drinks that the cruise line promoted as one of the highlights of the voyage. Jack stood near the railing with a rum punch in his hand, swaying slightly to the rhythm of the steel drum band that was playing tropical music on a small stage. The atmosphere was festive and carefree, exactly what he had needed after months of stress at his job in Boston. He had come on this cruise alone, hoping to decompress and forget about the office politics and deadline pressures that had been consuming his life. The deck was crowded with people of all ages, families with children, young couples dancing close together, groups of friends laughing and taking selfies against the stunning sunset backdrop. The ship's crew members moved through the crowd with trays of drinks, keeping everyone's glasses full. It was the kind of scene that appeared in cruise line advertisements, a perfect moment of vacation bliss. The commotion started near the bar area, perhaps 30 feet from where Jack was standing. At first, it was just raised voices, the kind of argument that sometimes breaks out when alcohol and close quarters mix. Jack turned toward the sound, curious, but not particularly alarmed. Arguments at bars were not uncommon, and the ship's security team was usually quick to intervene before things escalated. But this escalation happened fast, too fast for anyone to really process what was occurring. Jack saw a cluster of people near the bar, their body language aggressive and confrontational. He could not see exactly what was happening because other passengers were blocking his view, but he could hear shouting. Then he saw movement, a surge in the crowd, people pushing and shoving. And then someone went over the railing. Jack saw it clearly. One moment there were people struggling near the barrier that separated the deck from the open ocean. The next moment, a figure in a white shirt went backward over the railing, arms flailing, falling the 70 feet from the deck to the water below. The splash was barely audible over the music and the noise of the crowd. But Jack saw it. So did dozens of other people who happened to be looking in that direction. For a few seconds, there was a strange disconnect between what had just happened and how people were reacting. The music continued playing. Some passengers were still laughing and dancing, unaware that anything unusual had occurred. But those who had witnessed the fall were starting to scream, pointing at the water, their voices rising in panic. Jack rushed to the railing and looked down. The ship was moving at its normal cruising speed of approximately 20 knots, creating a massive wake of churning white water. But beyond the immediate turbulence, perhaps 100 yards behind the vessel now, Jack could see a person in the water. The figure was waving frantically, arms moving in the universal gesture of distress. Even from this distance, Jack could hear faint shouts for help carried on the evening breeze. More passengers were gathering at the railing now, all of them staring at the person in the water, all of them pointing and yelling. A woman standing next to Jack was screaming for someone to stop the ship. An older man was shouting for the crew to throw life preservers. Jack looked around frantically for crew members, for anyone in a uniform who could take action. But he realized something strange and terrifying. All the crew members who had been serving drinks and mingling with passengers just minutes earlier had vanished. The deck, which moments ago had been staffed by at least a dozen uniformed personnel, was now occupied only by panicked passengers. It was as if the crew had been swallowed by the ship itself, disappearing through doors and passages that only they knew about. Jack watched the person in the water growing smaller and smaller as the ship continued its forward momentum. The figure was still waving, still visible, but the distance was increasing with every passing second. He felt a crushing sense of helplessness. This was a massive cruise ship, not a speedboat that could stop on a dime. He knew that vessels of this size required miles to come to a complete stop, and turning around would take even longer. But surely they would try. Surely the captain would be notified immediately and would begin the rescue procedures that all cruise ships were supposed to have for man-overboard situations. A woman named Bethany, who was standing near Jack, had pulled out her phone and was recording video of the person in the water. Jack could see her screen. The figure was clearly visible, arms moving, head bobbing in the waves. The video would be clear evidence of what had happened, proof that someone had gone overboard and that there had been witnesses. Bethany was crying as she filmed, her hands shaking, but she kept the camera steady and focused on the water. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The person in the water was now just a tiny speck on the horizon, barely visible even to those who knew exactly where to look. The ship had not slowed. It had not changed course. It was continuing along its planned route as if nothing had happened. Jack felt sick to his stomach. He could not believe what he was witnessing. Someone was drowning in the ocean behind them, and the ship was sailing away. Where were the crew members? Where was security? Where was the captain? Why had no alarms been sounded? Finally, nearly 30 minutes after the person had gone overboard, security personnel arrived on the deck. They were led by Chief Walker, the head of the ship's security department, a tall man with gray hair and an air of authority. He approached the crowd of passengers who were still gathered at the railing, many of them in tears, all of them demanding to know why the ship had not stopped. Chief Walker raised his hands in a calming gesture and asked everyone to remain quiet so he could understand what had happened. Dozens of passengers began talking at once, their voices overlapping, everyone trying to explain that someone had fallen overboard during a fight at the bar. Jack stepped forward and gave a clear account. He had seen the person go over the railing. He had seen them in the water calling for help. At least 40 other passengers had witnessed the same thing. Chief Walker listened to the statements with an expression that Jack could not quite read. It was not shock or concern. It was more like annoyance, as if the passengers were creating an inconvenience with their ridiculous story. When everyone had finished talking, the security chief made a statement that left Jack feeling cold despite the warm Caribbean air. According to Chief Walker, no incident had been reported through official channels. None of the crew members working the deck party had witnessed anyone going overboard. No one had been reported missing from their cabin. There was no evidence that anything unusual had occurred. The ship's surveillance cameras, which monitored all public areas, had not captured any footage of someone falling into the water. The passengers erupted in protest. They had all seen it happen. They were not confused or mistaken. A person had gone over the railing and into the ocean, and the ship had sailed away without attempting a rescue. Bethany held up her phone and insisted she had video evidence. Chief Walker took her phone, promising to review the footage and return it shortly. He instructed all the passengers to return to their cabins and assured them that the matter would be investigated thoroughly. Jack did not go to his cabin. He remained on the deck with several other witnesses, all of them talking in hushed, angry voices about what they had seen and about the security chief's dismissive response. They exchanged cabin numbers and email addresses, agreeing to stay in contact and to provide statements to authorities when the ship docked. An hour later, Bethany received her phone back from security. When she opened her video app to show the footage to the group, she discovered that the file had been corrupted. The video would not play. She tried everything she could think of, but the evidence she had captured was gone. Jack saw the devastation on her face as she realized what had been done. Over the next 3 days, as the ship continued its voyage, Jack and the other witnesses attempted to get answers. They filed written statements with the ship's administration. They demanded to speak with the captain. They contacted the cruise line's customer service department. Every avenue they pursued led to the same response. There was no record of anyone going overboard. No passenger was missing. The incident the witnesses claimed to have seen had not occurred. When the ship finally docked in Miami, Jack and approximately 40 other passengers who had witnessed the event gathered in a conference room at a hotel near the port. They had agreed to compile all their accounts and present them to the Coast Guard and to local law enforcement. Every single person in that room told the same story. They had seen someone fall from the deck. They had seen that person in the water, alive and calling for help. They had watched the ship sail away without stopping. But without physical evidence, without video footage, without a missing person report, and without any cooperation from the cruise line, there was little the authorities could do. The ship sailed in international waters where the laws were murky and enforcement was complicated. The cruise line's lawyers issued statements denying that any incident had occurred and suggesting that the witnesses were confused or had misinterpreted something they had seen. Jack returned to his life in Boston. But he was not the same person who had boarded that cruise ship 7 days earlier. He had nightmares about the person in the water, arms waving frantically, growing smaller and smaller until they disappeared beneath the waves. He wondered who that person had been. Did they have a family? Were people somewhere waiting for them to come home, never knowing what had happened? Most of all, Jack could not shake the memory of how quickly the crew had vanished from the deck, as if they had been ordered to make themselves scarce. And he could not forget the expression on Chief Walker's face, that look of annoyance rather than concern. It suggested something far more disturbing than negligence. It suggested that the cruise line had protocols in place for making inconvenient incidents disappear, for protecting the company's reputation at the expense of human life. Jack never received answers about what happened that evening on the aft deck. The person who went into the water was never identified. The investigation, such as it was, went nowhere. And somewhere in the vast Caribbean Sea, a life ended while hundreds of witnesses watched helplessly from the deck of a cruise ship that never stopped. Daniel and his wife Sarah had been married for 10 years, and they had decided to celebrate their anniversary with a Caribbean cruise. They had never been on a cruise before, and the prospect of a week at sea, visiting tropical islands and enjoying unlimited food and entertainment seemed like the perfect way to mark a decade of marriage. Money was tight, however, so they booked the most affordable option available, an inside cabin on one of the older ships still in service. The cabin was small. barely larger than a walk-in closet, with no window or balcony to provide natural light or fresh air. When Daniel and Sarah first entered their assigned room, number 247 on the second deck, they were struck by how oppressively cramped it felt. Two narrow beds pushed together to form a double, a tiny bathroom with a shower stall that required turning sideways to enter, and perhaps 3 feet of floor space to move around. But they reminded themselves that they would spend most of their time exploring the ship and the ports, not sitting in the cabin. The first night aboard the ship, Daniel had difficulty sleeping. The air in the cabin felt thick and stale despite the air conditioning running at full blast. There was a heaviness to the atmosphere that he could not quite explain, as if the walls were pressing inward. He lay awake for hours, listening to the hum of the ship's engines and the occasional creak of metal expanding and contracting. Sarah slept soundly beside him, unbothered by the environment that was making Daniel increasingly uncomfortable. At some point in the early morning hours, perhaps 3 or 4 o'clock, Daniel thought he heard voices. They were faint, barely audible over the ambient noise of the ship, but they sounded like whispered conversations in a language he did not recognize. The words had an odd rhythm to them, rising and falling in patterns that did not match English or any other language Daniel was familiar with. He sat up in bed and listened intently, trying to determine where the sound was coming from. The voices seemed to be emanating from the walls themselves, as if people were having conversations inside the very structure of the ship. Daniel's first thought was that he was hearing passengers in the neighboring cabins, perhaps people speaking quietly so as not to wake their travel companions. But the more he listened, the more he realized the voices were not coming from adjacent rooms. They were coming from all around him, surrounding him in 3 dimensions. He woke Sarah and asked if she could hear anything unusual. She listened for a moment, yawning, then shook her head and told him he was probably hearing people in the hallway or the cabin above them. Sound traveled strangely on ships, she reminded him. He should try to get some sleep. Daniel lay back down, but the whispered conversations continued for another hour before finally fading away as dawn approached. The second night was worse. This time, the voices started earlier, beginning around midnight. Daniel heard them immediately upon turning off the cabin lights. The whispered conversations were louder than they had been the previous night, though still not loud enough to make out individual words. There were multiple voices, at least 4 or 5, maybe more, all speaking in that same unfamiliar language with its strange rhythmic cadence. Sarah woke on her own this time, disturbed by a sound she could not initially identify. She sat up and looked at Daniel in the darkness. She asked if he heard that, and he confirmed that he did. They both sat in silence, listening to the voices that seemed to be coming from inside the walls, from beneath the floor, from the ceiling above them. It was impossible to pinpoint a single source. The sound was everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah suggested they call the front desk and complain about noise from neighboring cabins. But Daniel pointed out that what they were hearing did not sound like it was coming from neighboring cabins. It sounded like it was coming from their own cabin, from the very structure surrounding them. Sarah admitted he was right. The sound was too close, too encompassing to be explained by typical cruise ship acoustics. They endured the whispered conversations for 3 hours before exhaustion finally allowed them to fall into a restless sleep. In the morning, over breakfast in the buffet, they discussed what they had experienced. Daniel suggested researching the ship's history. Perhaps there was something about this particular vessel that could explain the strange phenomena they were encountering. Using the ship's spotty internet connection, Daniel spent the afternoon searching for information about the cruise ship they were on. The vessel was 43 years old, originally built for transatlantic crossings before being converted to Caribbean cruise service. But before it had been a passenger cruise ship, Daniel discovered it had been used for an entirely different purpose. In the late 1970s, during a period of political upheaval in several Central American countries, the ship had been chartered to transport refugees. The lower decks, including the section where cabin 247 was now located, had been converted into temporary housing for people fleeing violence and persecution. The accommodations had been minimal, with dozens of people crowded into spaces designed for far fewer passengers. Daniel found a news article from 1978 that made his blood run cold. During one of these refugee transport voyages, the ship had encountered a severe storm in the Caribbean. The seas had been so violent that water had breached several of the lower deck compartments where the refugees were housed. The ship's crew had managed to contain the flooding and prevent the vessel from sinking, but not before 23 people had drowned, trapped in the flooded compartments as the ship struggled through the storm. The article provided coordinates that Daniel cross-referenced with the ship's current route. If his calculations were correct, they were sailing through the same waters where that tragedy had occurred 47 years earlier. He showed Sarah what he had found, and they both felt a creeping dread settling over them. Were the voices they were hearing somehow connected to those people who had died? That night, the third night of their cruise, the voices returned with an intensity that terrified both Daniel and Sarah. The whispered conversations began at 10 o'clock, immediately after they entered the cabin for the evening. But now the voices were no longer just whispers. They were louder, more urgent, speaking rapidly in multiple, overlapping languages. Daniel thought he could distinguish Spanish, possibly Portuguese, and other languages he could not identify. The tone of the voices had changed as well. They were no longer having casual conversations. The voices sounded desperate, frightened, calling out to each other. Daniel heard what sounded like names being shouted. He heard cries for help. The voices were rising in panic, and the sound was coming from all around the cabin, surrounding them completely. Sarah was crying, her hands pressed over her ears, begging for the voices to stop. Daniel searched the cabin frantically, looking for any rational explanation. He checked the air vents, thinking perhaps sound was being channeled through the ductwork. He examined the walls for speakers or intercom systems that might explain what they were hearing. But there was nothing. The cabin was exactly as it appeared. A small rectangular room with basic furnishings and no obvious source for the voices that were growing louder with each passing minute. Then the handprints appeared. Sarah saw them first and screamed, pointing at the wall beside the bed. Daniel turned and saw wet handprints materializing on the painted surface, as if invisible hands were pressing against the wall from the inside. More prints appeared on the opposite wall, then on the ceiling above their heads. Dozens of handprints, all wet, all appearing spontaneously on every surface in the cabin. Daniel ran to the bathroom to grab towels, thinking perhaps there was a leak and water was somehow creating the appearance of handprints. But when he entered the tiny bathroom, he stopped in the doorway, paralyzed by what he saw. Wet footprints were appearing on the floor, emerging from nowhere, tracking from the shower across the tile to the bathroom door. He watched as each footprint materialized, one after another, as if an invisible person was walking out of the empty shower stall. He backed out of the bathroom and grabbed Sarah. They had to leave the cabin immediately. He did not care that it was nearly midnight. They could not stay in this room any longer. They gathered their phones and room keys and rushed out into the corridor, not bothering to change out of their pajamas. The ship's guest services desk was located, On the 5th deck, Daniel and Sarah took the elevator, both of them shaking, Sarah still crying. When they reached the desk and explained that they needed to change cabins immediately, the night clerk asked if there was a problem with their accommodation. Daniel tried to explain about the voices and the handprints, but even as he spoke the words aloud, he realized how insane he sounded. The clerk checked the computer system and informed them that the ship was completely sold out. Every cabin was occupied. There were no rooms available for transfer. Daniel begged, offering to pay for an upgrade, willing to take any cabin anywhere on the ship. But the clerk could only apologize and suggest they try to rest and perhaps discuss the matter with management in the morning. They spent the remainder of the night in the 24-hour buffet, drinking coffee and trying to process what they had experienced. Other passengers came and went, cheerfully loading plates with midnight snacks, oblivious to the horror that Daniel and Sarah were enduring. How could everyone else be so carefree when there was something terrible happening in cabin 247? The voices reached their peak intensity at 2:47 in the morning. Daniel noticed the time because he had been checking his watch obsessively, counting down the hours until dawn. At that exact moment, 2:47 a.m., he and Sarah both felt something. A wave of overwhelming despair washed over them, a grief so profound it was physically painful. Sarah collapsed against the table, sobbing uncontrollably. Daniel felt tears streaming down his face without understanding why he was crying. The sensation lasted for exactly 3 minutes, then lifted as suddenly as it had descended. In the aftermath, they sat in stunned silence, both of them feeling emotionally drained and physically exhausted. Daniel looked up the newspaper article again on his phone and found the detail he had missed before. The flooding that had killed 23 refugees had occurred at 2:47 in the morning on September 18, 1978. They were experiencing the echoes of that tragedy, reliving the final moments of people who had died in terror and desperation, trapped in the lower decks of a ship that was now being used for luxury vacations. The voices, the handprints, the footprints, the overwhelming grief, all of it was a residual haunting, the psychic impression left behind by mass death. Daniel and Sarah endured the remaining 4 nights of the cruise, taking turns staying awake in the cabin, while the other attempted to sleep. The voices came every night at the same times, building to that terrible climax at 2:47 each morning. They counted down the days until they could disembark and never return to that floating monument to tragedy. 6 months after their cruise, Daniel learned that the ship had been decommissioned and sold for scrap. He wondered if the decision had anything to do with cabin 247 and how many. Other passengers had experienced what he and Sarah had endured. Some places should not be repurposed. Some tragedies leave marks that can never be erased, no matter how many coats of paint are applied or how many years pass. The ocean remembers, and so do the dead who rest beneath its waves.